of scripture I'd like to call your attention to this morning is found in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. I'll be reading from the King James Version of the Bible, and it says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us." I want to use as a thought this morning from which to preach, run your race. Run your race. There are two races occurring simultaneously in our lives today. One is a race for a vaccine, a race for a cure, a race for a new drug or a new treatment, a race to eliminate the COVID-19 virus. There's another race, however, that we all participate in. It's the race we call life. Before COVID-19 invaded our lives, we referred to this race oftentimes as a rat race. So Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 9, the race is not given to the swift nor to the strong. So for obvious reasons, life is often compared to a race. Because of the very nature of our lives, we know, we are well aware, and we are cognizant of the fact that this race is not a sprint. This race is a marathon. In the midst of this COVID-19 reality, this new normal, this race that we call life seems to get longer and more difficult each day. The Apostle Paul encourages the believers in our text who were in his day in a race, and in this race they were being persecuted. But he encouraged them to live their lives as well and as fully as possible despite the adversity and the circumstances they were certain to encounter. I came also today to encourage somebody to run your race, to live your life as fully as possible in the midst of the adversity in which we live. Now, the book of Hebrews is an epistle in which Paul says, let me show you how faith works. He begins in chapter 11 with a definition of faith. In verse 1, he says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And for the next 29 verses, Paul introduces us to champions, a group of Old Testament saints. And these Old Testament saints were actually the heroes of the faith. They were actually champions who had run their race and run their race to victory. So he mentions Abel, he mentions Enoch, he mentions Abraham and Sarah, he mentions Moses, and he mentions all of the great heroes of faith. And then about verse 30 to verse 35, he mentions the hardships that these Old Testament saints faced. He suggests that these men and women who have watched this experienced God, who know God is real, who have become champions of the faith. They experience God not only in their triumphs, but they experienced him in their tragedy, not only in their victories, but also in their valleys. How do we know that? Listen to me, saints. God is a God of faith. And they did it all by faith. Get this. When you live on a whole nother level, on a different dimension. What do you mean, Pastor? See, you can experience God making good on his promises. You get to see God make good on his promises because his promises are received by faith. And as a consequence of you living by faith, you get to receive God's promises, God's provisions, and God's power. Amen. See, faith is simply acting like what God says is true. I'm walking by faith. You know what faith is like when you're walking by faith. It's like this. Faith is acting like something is so, even when it is not so, in order that it might be so, simply because God said so. So chapter 12 begins this morning with verse 1, Paul referring to these champions of the faith as a cloud of witnesses. Now, I need to get technical for just a moment here because people of God, the Greek word for witness is marithruon. It's where we get our English word, martyr. But Paul refers to them as witnesses, as one who gives testimony in a court of law. Let me stop for a moment and ask you the question that begs to be asked this morning. If you were in a courtroom serving as a witness this morning, what would your testimony be? If you were called to be a Christian witness, not a Muslim witness, not a Buddhist witness, but a Christian witness, what would your testimony be in the midst of this global pandemic? What would your testimony be in the midst of the quarantine, the shelters in place, and the social distancing, etc.? Remember, child of God, your testimony as a Christian is not what you did, but what Christ has done. Not what you experienced in the crisis, but how you experienced God in the midst of your crisis. If I had the church choir with me this morning, maybe they would sing one of those old songs by the Williams Brothers, the testimony. I could have been dead and gone, but Lord, you let me live testimony, and I thank God I'm still alive. And I want to say this morning, I wonder if you gave your testimony, would you say, I know that there are some tough times that we're going through right now, but the Lord is on our side. I know that we're getting through the toughest part of this curve, but the Lord is working behind the scenes. And even though we're trying to bend the curve, the hand of God is working on our behalf. And even though weeping may endure for a night, I know that joy comes in the morning. You see, Paul uses these examples in chapter 11 to prove that God does not abandon us when we suffer hardships and trials. Instead, God uses these experiences to train us, to develop us, to mature us. Paul also knows this because of his personal testimony. You see, Paul was not always a witness for Jesus Christ. No, Paul was on the Damascus road, and he was en route to persecute Christians. But a bright light shined down from heaven, and the scripture says that it knocked Paul off of his beast. And then Paul heard a voice from heaven say, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? When Paul heard these words, he answered, Lord, who are you? I am Jesus whom you persecute. At that moment, Paul became a witness for Jesus Christ. Are you going to be like Paul this morning? Are you going to become a witness when God speaks into your life? Will you become a witness witness for him. But here it is today. Notice Paul, what he does in verse 1b. He says, there are some things when you run this race that you will have to live with. But there are also some things that you'll have to live without. Now, brothers and sisters, Pauline theology is fraught with rhetoric and characterizations that draw on the symbolism of running a race. That's why I was surprised to see Paul use that same symbolism again. He says, in order to be a witness, watch this, we have to lay aside every weight. Now, I'm sure that you have witnessed runners who have oftentimes attached weights around their ankles, and they affix, they strap these leg weights, these ankle weights, while they are training for a race so that they can strengthen their legs. See, runners know that the harder they train and the heavier the weight, the stronger they become. But when the training is over and it's time to run the race, the runner takes off the weights. Reason being, the thing that once burdened them will now bless them. What once hindered them will now help them. Well, you may ask, if I'm running this race, Pastor White, what is it that I must lay aside? What is it I must take off? I must let go. Peter helps us with this in his pericope in 2 Peter chapter 5, around verse 7. He says, cast all your cares upon him. In the NIV version, he says, cast all your anxieties. Where do I cast them? On him. Peter helps us to understand that the cares of this life, if you're not careful, they will weigh you down. I'm a living witness that cares and problems and anxieties and circumstances, stuff will weigh you down. And you can't run your race effectively because you are weighed down, you're bogged down with the emotional baggage that makes life stale, stagnant, and a constant struggle. But Peter says you have to cast those things away. You have to throw them off. You have to throw off the anxiety. Throw off the pain and let God heal you. Throw off the sorrow and let God restore your joy. See, to be a witness this morning, you have to cast your cares, throw off some things, but also you have to cut loose some things. Let me show you what I'm talking about. He says, lay aside every weight. So some things you have to cast or throw off, but some of the emotional baggage that we have is like anchors. They're like emotional anchors. Let me paint the picture for you. These are like anchors tied to a ship. When a ship goes through a storm, the captain will give the order to drop the anchor. But when the storm is over, the captain says, cut loose the ropes that are attached to the anchor. I don't want to sound corrective this morning, but I do want to say that some of the anchors that we have been tied to in our lives, some of those anchors we're just going to have to cut loose. We're going, in the midst of this storm called COVID-19, we will have to cut loose some of the emotional baggage that we have encountered. And the only way we can move forward is to cut them loose. Cut loose the anger. Cut loose the apathy. Cut loose the anxiety. Look at the verse again. He says, lay aside every weight and the sin. Now, I need to slow down for just a moment because when he says sin, we need to look at that more closely. Because he says, the sin which doth so easily beset us. Another Living Translation says, it so easily trips us up. He says, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that easily trips us up. Now let me show you how this works. You see, sin is the works of the flesh. Righteousness is of the Spirit. And when we read Galatians chapter 5, we see that the works of the flesh are listed right there, and sin goes on, and Paul tells us that sin is something that makes you go longer and stay longer than you want to stay and do things that you don't want to do. And so sin can easily trip us up, because sin is like an injury to a runner. Once a runner is injured, then he's not able to compete at a high level. He's not able to run the race. Paul tells us, run your race. Don't run your race with weights or with works. So Paul shows us what we have to run this race without. But then he shows us what we have to run this race with. Can I pause parenthetically and say that smart people will tell you you have to run the race with intelligence. Successful people will tell you you have to run the race with ambition. And powerful people will tell you you got to run the race with influence. But I love this text because right there, Paul tells us, prayerful folk will tell you that you've got to run this race with patience. James chapter 1 and verse 2 and 3, you know it. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. This word patience literally means endurance. Why endurance? Because as I said before, life is a marathon, not a sprint. And our faith is being tried, it's being tested. And even in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, God is saying to us, I'm going to give you some supernatural provision of my endurance. See, it's not going to be not by might, nor by power, nor by anything man-made. But God says it's by my spirit, by my supernatural provision am I going to sustain you. God wants us to experience the supernatural provision of his endurance. By faith, God will unleash this supernatural power in your life. Once you receive this power, you will be resilient and you will be able to run longer than you could have ever imagined. God is going to grant you what runners call the second wind. See, runners say when you're running a race and you get to a point where you think that you have nothing left, you think that you are just completely exhausted, and just when you think you're about to collapse, you get your second wind. I want to encourage somebody today. Don't throw in the towel. Don't give up. Don't drop out of the race. God is about to give you your second wind. And when he does that, you can do like the prophet Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 40. You can run and not be weary. You can walk and not faint. Run your race today. Not with the weights of the cares of life, not with the works of sin, but run your race with the wisdom that God will give you his supernatural endurance to run this race